Okay, and I think we are more or less ready to go. Let me mess about with my um, camera setup. And good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. It's your blue-eyed boy from the beautiful Bay Area. My name's Tad Williams. I am a writer, and I am going to be reading in just a short while. But first, I'm going to say hello to people first. And who have we got? We've got Mihai. Hello, Dirk. Hello, Ronnie. Good to see you. Olaf, old friend. Always a pleasure. Chris. Hello, Chris. Hello, Felina. Doc. Hi, Doc. Petra. Writing in from snowy Amsterdam. The beard. That was a laziness beard from last week, and I still haven't done anything about it to change it. I get bored. You know, when you have limited top of the head fashion choices, you know, you get bored very quickly with your facial hair. Except I don't like mustaches by themselves, so that's why I never grow one of those. I did once, one time, and it lasted for one evening, which was actually a very interesting evening because I was doing a political fundraiser thing with Jello Biafra from the dead Kennedys many years ago. And I got home from that and I looked at it and I said, that mustache was a tactical mistake, and I shaved it off. That's the only time I've ever had a mustache, honest to God. So yeah, I got bored. I didn't want to shave. I just said, okay, I'll just do the parts that aren't beard. Anyway, Carol, hello, good evening. Rosalba, greetings to you. Michael, hello, Michael. And Holger, hi. Yes, we are fine here. That I and the family are as fine as we can be. I'll explain why in a moment. Christine, hello. In Berlin, it's freezing and snowing too, so it's not just Amsterdam. Wouter, thank you, Wouter. I'll talk about that briefly, but appreciated. Andre, and another from checking in from Berlin. Great to see you too. Mahmoud, a pleasure as always. Jeremy, hi, Jeremy. Yes, good middle of the night to you too. Paul, hi, and thank you. And yes, I will mention it. Hello, Ilva. Sarah, good whatever 2 a.m. is considered. Yeah, exactly. It's kind of betwixt and between. Even for me, it's always confusing because I'm always going Sunday at 2 a.m., but I never think of 2 a.m. as Sunday because I've never been to bed before 2 a.m. in years. So for me, this is still Saturday night. Anyway, no, this was Michael's asking a question about the thing I did with Jello. I don't remember specifically what the thing was about because I was doing political radio back in those days, and it was in the 80s, as I recall, or very early 90s. And it was some kind of a political thing, but it wasn't in San Francisco. It was, as I recall, it was in San Jose or somewhere like that. Anyway, it's been a long, long time. So anyway, yes, a couple of you have kindly sent condolences, and many of you sent condolences on my Facebook page. We lost a beloved dog this week. And those of you who know, those of you who are animal people know, it's a family member. And Frankie was a family member, and Frankie was a pretty amazingly wonderful, horrible dog. I won't go into the reasons why he was horrible, although he, just by his sheer horribleness, he cost us at least $20,000 that we know of. Because when we sold our house a few years back, well, more than a few years now, about 8 years back, when we sold our house, we discovered that he had secretly peed in many places on our wood floor, and we actually had to take that $20,000 off the price that we had agreed on with the people we were selling it to, in order to make up for the damage that he had done. Because dog urine, apparently it's like fire, it just burns the wood. It was horrible. I hate to start off talking about urine, but to be honest, it's impossible to have a conversation about Frankie, much as we loved him, without talking about his hideous habit of just sort of peeing whenever and wherever the mood took him, no matter what we tried to do over the years. He was the last purebred dog we got. Our dogs since then, our dogs since then have been rescues. And if we get more dogs in the future, they will be rescues also. But Deb had her heart set on a Chihuahua. That was our first Chihuahua about 14 years ago. He made it to 14 years. And he was, as Deborah puts it, he was a Shakespearean clown. Both of the Chihuahuas are Shakespearean clowns. And just when things get really super serious, then all of a sudden they would come in, crashing into each other and acting silly and stupid and all that. And they were quite charming. Well, Walter's still with us, so we still have 2 dogs. But it feels a bit strange after we had 4 for many years, and then we were down to 3, and now we're down to 2. And but anyway, so thank you all very much for the kind words. It was really painful, as you know, if you're an animal person, it's not that dissimilar to losing a beloved friend. So I thank you for all the kind words. It's been a tough week because of that, but life has to go on, and it happened not very rapidly. He'd had pulmonary breathing problems particular for quite some time, but we had sort of hoped we might find a combination of medicines or maybe an operation. But then it just came on very badly in the last couple of days, and we knew he wasn't going to hold on long enough for anything. And so, we made the terrible, painful decision to, there's the word, euthanize. I don't like saying put to sleep, because that seems like, I don't know, it's such a euphemism. It's kind of, but I don't really like euthanized either, because it's much more clinical sounding than the actual thing is when, you're standing around with your beloved pet weeping. But it was that or watch him suffering. And of course, nobody with any sense whatsoever or kindness in them wants to see that. But anyway, we're struggling on, and we're going on with our life, and there you go. So again, I appreciate all the kind words, and those of you who've lost beloved animals, you know exactly what it's like, and those of you who haven't, I'm happy for you. It's never fun. Anyway, so not a whole lot else to talk about tonight, really, in the sense of things that have been happening. A lot of things have been happening, but some of them are not things that are particularly anything to be talked about on, on a public thing. They're just, stuff going on. And one of our dear friends, one of my oldest friends, lost his mom. Well, his family, they're all friends of mine, so it's not just him. But that has been tough and sorry. God, I'm having trouble. Lost his dad. Sorry is what I was trying to say. And it's in my mind because I need to write to his mom. So that's been going on, and a lot of work and a lot of other stuff. And just things, and of course, I just finished the deadline on the story. I've jumped back into the novel again, which is Navigator's Children, and things are busy, 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 but we're still locked down. So, it's all happening in this kind of small box. And while it's life and it's just as vivid as life ever is, it's happening in a rather small container at the moment. So, not a whole lot to report. Just want to tell you, there was really nothing that would have kept me from doing this. Because it's important to me too now at this point. We're approaching a year, I think, of doing this now. Still a month or so away, but I've been doing this for a long time. And, I feel like I have an obligation to present you with this not horrifying, this mildly disturbing face twice every week. So here I am, and here we all are, and I am going to read. So where we were at the last reading was that of War of the Flowers, in case any of you have forgotten, or are new to the reading. Theo, the main character, who used to think he was immortal, not immortal, but a mortal, and in fact, spent his entire life growing up here in the San Francisco Bay Area, managed to get chased through a portal to fairyland by a bodiless evil spirit that takes its physical form from things it can find where it is at any given time, and found himself in Fairy. So since then, he has been caught up in a very mysterious set of circumstances that turned into a war in which many fairy people have been killed. And Theo still doesn't know why he was brought there, but since he's been there, he's discovered that he is not, in fact, mortal, that he is, in fact, of fairy blood himself. So just recently, he has fallen in with a group of, well, you'd have to call them revolutionaries, led by a goblin named Mud Button, or Mud Bug Button, as he has revealed, since to reveal one's middle name is a huge deal among the goblins. Just recently, he has been out with his friend Cumber Sedge, who is a fairisher, and which is a kind of fairy, and Streety Nettle, who is a fairy who suffered a terrible accident that has kind of affected his mental abilities, but also has given him a certain power over magical devices. And they've been out doing something for Mud Bug Button without actually knowing, and now they've just come back to the bridge where all of Button's followers live in a kind of a squatter camp. So that's what's going on in the story. And so Cumber and Streety and all have just come back, and they've discovered that there are a bunch of fairy women, upper class fairy women, who are doing charity work and have brought food to all the refugees living near this bridge on the outskirts of the big fairy city. And that's where we are. They skirted the bridge and all the activity there, but as they crossed the broad levee toward the river, Theo's attention was arrested by one of the flower women, part of a group of nearly a dozen, standing on a flatbed truck as they handed down sacks of something or other. It took a moment to be certain it was her. She was dressed in something a great deal less fashionable than the dress she had been wearing when he last saw her. Oh my... He grabbed Cumber's arm. It's Poppy! Who? Cumber had to let go of Streety, whom he had been helping. The tall fairy wavered like a radio tower in a high wind, but stopped before tipping over. Poppy, this girl I met on my way to the city. She was a good 20 yards away, and her raven black hair was confined under a scarf, but he felt sure he wasn't mistaken. She had on a sort of shimmery, earth-colored jumpsuit, which he guessed might be the flower equivalent of workers' clothes. With her headscarf, she resembled some idealized Rosie the Riveter off a Second World War propaganda poster. Actually, even in his miserable mood, he had to admit she looked quite fetching. Poppy Thornapple? Poppy Thorn... You mean the first counselor's daughter? Cumber sounded like he just tried to swallow a hedgehog. Theo stared at her, full of revulsion for what she represented, but also a surprising longing. The Thornapple name had not meant much to him when they had first met. An intellectual, rather than a visceral understanding that she was one of the enemy, if not herself personally guilty. Now it was hard to separate her from the smirk Hellebore had worn as the dragon swept down on Daffodil House with a belly full of murder. Still, it was impossible to watch her and not feel a twinge of regret for what might have been. He remembered her pushing herself up against him, warm and soft and trusting. And her father helped murder 1,000 people in Daffodil House. An image of the scatter of charred bodies on the comb floor swam up to him. He was at war with himself, that's what it felt like. Even if it wasn't her fault, she's part of that, right? Like one of those pretty little Fräuleins that went to Hitler's parties and never wanted to know what was really going on. He turned his back on her and gestured to Cumber that he was ready to continue. After all, that's what her daddy does, so she can go to her private school and hang out in clubs snorting pixie dust with the other rich flower kids, while her daddy's partner, Hellebore, keeps my friend Applecore in a jar on his desk. Oh, sweet Jesus, of course, Applecore. Maybe she can help me get to Applecore. Hang on, he said, and turned back again. Cumber sighed wearily, but snagged the back of Streety's shirt. The tall young fairy stopped again, without comment or evident curiosity, like a toy whose battery had run down. Theo examined the scene more carefully. Not only was Poppy in the middle of around a dozen other flower women, but even if he wanted to dare it, and could elbow his way through the crowd of refugees until he was close enough to make her hear him, the truck itself was surrounded by huge ogre guards and a few almost equally tough-looking Dooney drivers. Even if they hadn't seen Hellebore's little version of Fairyland's Most Wanted, or didn't just beat the bejesus out of him on principle, they might still remember his face when they eventually did see it on the local equivalent of the nightly news. He had no right to risk bringing parliamentary troops down on the camp. Even if he happened to be gone by then, it would probably land Button and Primrose and the rest in a dungeon somewhere and destroy the little goblin's plans. So much for the sudden idea that Poppy might be some use to him getting to Applecore. He couldn't reach her without too much of a risk, and in a little while she'd be gone. He obviously couldn't go to her house and ring the doorbell. "Hi, Mr. Thornapple, I'm the guy you wanted to torture. Can Poppy come out and play?" Unless. It was a ridiculous idea, but so was being a fugitive in Fairyland, not to mention dragons and goblins and every other damn thing that had happened to him. He turned to the gangly figure beside him. "Streety, you said you know Poppy, right? Poppy Thornapple?" "Theo, what are you doing?" Cumber looked worried, but Cumber always looked worried. "I'm asking him a question. Streety, did you hear me?" It was like watching a piece of an iceberg crack, break loose, and tumble into the sea, a process so achingly slow that you could only sit back and wait. After what seemed half a minute, the tall fairy blinked and said, "Poppy, she's nice. I like her voice. Because you hear her talking sometimes, right? I want to talk to her now. Is there some way you can make that happen?" He looked at the long, puzzled face, and his heart sank. It was ridiculous, of course. Most of Streety's strange abilities seemed to be involuntary. Just because he seemed to be able to hear Thornapple House communications didn't mean... "But Theo," Streety Nettle said slowly, "you don't have a shell." Shit. He just assumed something magical could be done, that Streety could somehow connect him directly to Poppy, but Fairyland magic seemed to work in a much more mechanical way than that, or at least it did in this modern era. So, of course, he didn't have a shell. "So, I can talk to her, I guess," said Streety, "but how can you talk to her?" I know, it was a stupid idea. He scuffed his toe in the dirt. She was standing up now, wiping her forehead with the back of her hand, staring off across the fens. He wondered what she was thinking. "Whoa, hang on," he said as the fairy's words caught up with him. "You can talk to her?" Streety nodded. Cumber's worried look grew by a brow furrow or two. What in the name of the trees are you trying to do?" Theo ignored the fairisher. "Then will you talk to her? Will you tell her what I tell you to say?" "I'll try, Theo, but my head, it hurts a bit." "I know, and I'm sorry. I'll keep it short. Go ahead, see if you can reach her." He was surprised to see Streety lower his long chin to his chest and close his eyes instead of facing the truck where Poppy and the other women stood, then realized that unless he had been paying a lot more attention than he usually did, Streety probably did not even know she was a few yards away. He thought about telling him, but across the camp, Poppy was already reaching her hand into the pocket of her garment. She took out a slim object that Theo felt sure must be the same silvery wand she had used in Starlightshire Station, and lifted it up, listening. "Have you ever talked to her before, Streety?" Theo asked suddenly. Streety started to repeat his words, then shook his head. "Then don't bother to tell her who you are. Just tell her that Theo wants to see her. No, meet with her. That you're a friend of his, and it's important Theo gets to meet with her." Streety spoke the words into midair, paraphrasing awkwardly. Theo watched Poppy. He could not quite make out her expression from such a distance, but she turned away from her companions and walked a few steps up the bed of the truck as though seeking privacy. After a pause of some seconds, Streety Nettle opened his eyes and looked at Theo, face full of distress. "She says, how does she know I'm a friend of yours? How does she know, Theo?" He was shivering a little. Theo felt a pang of guilt at putting him through what was clearly a difficult task after the heavy lifting he'd been doing at Elysium House. "Ask her if she remembers the songs I sang to her." But she probably wouldn't recognize the words to New York, New York, even if he could coach Streety through singing it. "And tell her that I still remember how old she is, but I don't care." "Jesus, what are you thinking, Vilmos?" he asked himself as Streety haltingly relayed the message. "You had to pick two things that are all wrapped up with romance. What are you doing messing with this girl's feelings?" He took a breath. Saving apple core, of course. And it wasn't entirely false either. He did like Poppy Thornapple. He had been confused, and he was even more confused now after what had happened at Daffodil House. But there was still something there. "Yeah, but she's a schoolgirl," he told himself. "A schoolgirl old enough to be your great-grandmother," came the predictable rebuttal from somewhere deep in his hindbrain. He looked up and saw that Streety was waiting for him patiently. "What does she say?" "She says she has to finish doing something this afternoon, but she'll meet you this evening." "Where?" Tell her to pick a place and a time." He was pleased with the success of using Streety as a conduit, feeling a little of the ebullience he had felt that first night, rolling into the city, despite all that had gone so disastrously wrong. "And tell her to make it close to where she is now. I know what she's doing today." Streety dutifully recited Theo's words, then listened to the reply. "She wants to know how you know what she's doing. Tell her to look just east of the bridge." "Theo!" Cumber's worried look had taken a turn into real fear, but Theo ignored him. As Poppy turned from side to side, staring out from the back of the truck, Theo took a few steps away from Streety and Cumber Sedge and waved. Again, he couldn't quite see the look on her face, but this time he could guess. "Tell her that's to show I trust her." Streety listened to her reply for a long time. Cumber was pacing. "She says she'll meet you at a place called the Chamber of Congregation on Glaistig Haven Road. between Twilight District and Eastwater, when the Queen's ring rises. Theo had no idea what that meant. A star, he guessed, but he figured someone could explain it to him. Tell her that's great. I'll come alone. I hope she will too. Theo! Shut up, Cumber. Tell her that, Streety. Then we're finished. You can hang up or whatever you do. She was still staring in his direction. He waved again, a little less broadly this time, then turned away. He had a feeling he couldn't quite explain, a certain faith that she wouldn't immediately call in her father's bodyguards or the constables. But there was no sense standing out in public in case he was wrong, and no sense getting Streety and Cumber into trouble too if he had let himself get overconfident. Come on, Cumber. I want to think. And someone has to tell me what time it is when the Queen's ring rises. It rose at what would be about 8 o'clock, mortal time, a fat yellow star near the western horizon. Theo saw it gleaming bright against the black sky as he found the restaurant and ducked in through the low door. The chamber of congregation was a kobold place, a small, windowless, self-consciously hip establishment in an alley just off Glaistig Haven Road, which was at the center of a sort of raffish shopping district near the Eastwater docks. Kobolds were cavern creatures, and the lobby was very dark, but Theo still felt unpleasantly conspicuous. He wedged himself into a corner behind the Maître d''s table, next to a glass tank full of blind white cave salamanders, and hoped Poppy would show up soon. It was the kind of place where every customer who came through the door gave him at least a quick inspection. Not because they recognized him, he realized after some panicky moments, but because they were hoping he was someone worth recognizing. It was just the kind of place where everybody checked out everybody else, as a matter of principle. Trying to look natural, Theo turned away from the front door and examined the slate walls that gave the restaurant the look of having been carved directly into solid rock. All around the lobby, strange pictures of what he guessed were kobolds and various underground animals had been incised into the dark surface and then lightly brushed with some phosphorescent chemical so that they seemed to float a few inches out from the walls. Theo had no idea if they were purely decorative or based on actual kobold folk art. In fact, he didn't even know if there was such a thing as kobold folk art. And even if there was, he couldn't guess whether it was ultra cool, just respectable, sort of last year, or tacky as bullfight pictures and card-playing dogs. Of course, even a black velvet bullfight picture in the proper context could be cool again. I just don't know how any of it works here, from the most important stuff to the least important. I should make a note to myself. Under no circumstances try to pretend you're someone who actually grew up in fairyland. Theo? He turned and felt his insides lurch just a little. Even in the dim light, she didn't look like an enemy, but like a friend, at the least. Hi. Thanks for coming. He paused, uncertain of what to do, then took her hand and held it for a moment before letting go. Oh, that's smooth, he told himself. Maybe after you finish shaking your hand, you could give her a free sample of floor wax or something. I didn't think you'd really be here. Poppy was still not quite making eye contact. She was dressed up a little more than when he had seen her at the bridge. Black coat and long skirt and a simple gray sweater, yet somehow there was a determinedly bohemian air to the outfit. Perhaps it was the flat sandals, or the gleaming strand around her neck of something that looked like silver but glinted in colors of firelight. Theo knew enough about women and their clothes to recognize she was trying to strike an appropriate balance between what? Between liking him and hating him? Between wanting to look good and not wanting to look too available? Just because he knew a mixed message when he saw one didn't mean he knew exactly which messages were being mixed. After an awkward pause, he said, Could we sit down? I'm feeling a bit conspicuous today. Who called me? she asked as a little kobold in a decorative hooded jacket led them to a table. He was very strange. Stranger than you know. I'll explain later. The table was along one of the back walls, out of the direct line of the firelight. As he relaxed, he realized he was extremely hungry. What do they serve here? Is the food good? It's lovely, although I've only been here a couple of times. She looked around. You know, my brother was killed in a tavern just down the street. Oh, my Poppy, that's terrible. Are you sure you want to eat here? She shrugged. I know you think I'm ghastly, but we were never close. In fact, I didn't like him at all. He was a nasty, cruel boy. Clearly uncomfortable, she opened up her menu, which glowed with a thin ivory light of its own. What are you going to have? It's almost all fungus, but they do amazing things with it. Mushrooms, he reminded himself after a slight flinch. Mushrooms are fungus. Lots of fungus in Chinese food, too. Still, it was hard to get too enthusiastic. You order for me. The ethereal light from the menu bathed her face as though she were a portrait by Vermeer. It was seductive. All of it, not just the pretty young woman across the table from him. It was wonderful to be sitting in a restaurant again, just as though he had returned to normal life. If he squinted his eyes so he didn't notice the bird-headed woman in a booth nearby, if he pretended another customer's aggressive display of wings was a costuming affectation rather than living appendages, he could imagine he was back in his own world. In fact, it was too seductive. A kobold waiter stood by the table. Theo had not even noticed him approach. He was not the most attractive type Theo had seen in fairyland. Kobolds, although humanoid, had a bit of a look of a hairless rodent, their noses large and prominent so that the rest of their faces seemed to lag behind, their almost translucent pale pink skin wrinkled like someone's toes who had been in the bath too long. But, despite the underslung jaw, the waiter had a shy, sweet smile, and Theo suddenly wondered if he were like Cumber, a student working in a restaurant to pay his way through university, determined to make a life among those who thought themselves his superiors. Had he fought his way up from some place like that midnight dark kobold village under the railroad line? Yeah, everybody's got a story, he thought, and looked at Poppy. Do I know hers as well as I think I do? Did the masters want something to drink? The waiter asked. Exhausted and overwhelmed, Theo asked for water. Poppy, perhaps being cautious for reasons of her own, ordered a glass of wine instead of a wing bender. Look, he said when the little waiter had retreated, there are some things I really need to talk to you about. Oh, me too. I've run away from home. What? I've had a terrible fight with my father. The real kind, not just the shouting lot kind. He wants me to marry Lord Hellebor's son, Anton. It's impossible. He's completely mad, disgusting. And that stepbrother of his, or whatever it is. She shuddered. It wasn't a theatrical gesture. It would have happened anyway. I just can't live with those people anymore. And after what they did to Daffodil House and the Hollyhocks and the Lilies, Theo, I saw you with Cyrus Jonquil. You must have heard what happened to his family's house. To his whole family. He looked at her, stunned. She had run away. Good for her, of course, but for him? What's wrong, Theo? You must know about Daffodil House, even if you are from out of town. I was there. I was in it when it happened. Bleeding black iron. Were you really? She stared. I wondered why you didn't call when I practically... Oh, Theo, that's... I'm sorry. To his chagrin, she began to cry. I'm so sorry. It wasn't your fault. What had happened to the careless schoolgirl who dismissed her own brother's death as an inconvenience? He tried to hand her his napkin, but she had already found a handkerchief and was half-heartedly wiping her nose. It wasn't your fault, Poppy. It was my family. My horrible family. Have you really run away? Could you go back? She shook her head and then blew her nose again. My father has the household guards looking for me all over the city. That's why I couldn't meet you at one of the places I usually go. He doesn't like being defied, the old monster. Theo took a deep breath. Not only wasn't he going to be able to use her to get to Hellebore, as he had half hoped, he now had the added danger that he might be picked up by her father's troops if they happened to find him with her. Well, there it is. I'm fucked. That's it. Period. End of story. He supposed it didn't really matter anyway. Even if she could have got him into Hellebore House, he hadn't had even the ghost of an idea where to go from there. In a way, it was liberating. He still had to think of something to do about Applecore, but he didn't have to manipulate Poppy to do it. He hadn't felt very good about that. He looked her over carefully. He wanted to open himself to her, but he couldn't quite shake the image of a blithe, pretty Hitler maiden. He wanted to open himself to her, but he couldn't quite shake the image of blithe, pretty Hitler maidens going to lovely parties in Berlin, while the SS dragged the undesirables off to camps. Have you really left? Not just having a little moment, then you'll go back if Daddy says you don't have to marry the Hellebore kid, maybe raises your allowance? The tears were still rimming her eyes, but her face abruptly went cold. Is that what you think? That I'd go back and live with those murderers for a bigger allowance? She picked up her purse and began to stand. Theo reached out to take her arm, but she shook him off. I really am a fool, he said. I tried to tell myself that what my father was... Oh, sorry. Theo reached out to take her arm, but she shook him off. I really am a fool, she said. I tried to tell myself that what my father was doing was just politics. Wrong. And I tried to tell myself that I had misjudged you. That it was my fault for playing games, that you really were a nice guy. I was wrong about a lot of things, I guess. Theo stood up as she started to turn away. His chair fell over. Other diners had begun to look at them. Poppy, please, come back. I have some things to tell you. The fairy folk on either side of them were whispering. Shit, he thought. If they don't recognize me, they'll probably recognize her. Sit down, please. She let herself be drawn back down. He righted his chair and hunched over the table. Tell me what? She asked, dabbing at her face again. I have to confess something. What the hell, right? Her face became still, and her eyes mistrustful, as though a curtain had been drawn and she were peering out from behind it. You have a wife back home in Daisyland, right? A little suburban place in Rowan? Children? Your own second-hand hob? He laughed, despite himself, even though he felt like he was about to jump out of a window without knowing what was on the other side. Oh, no, nothing like that. No, I wanted to tell you. He leaned forward. The other diners appeared to have lost interest again, but there was nothing wrong with taking precautions. I'm 30 years old, Poppy. What? Do you think that's funny? She started to get up again. Don't! It's the truth! Liar! How could that be? She stopped, goggled. Black iron! You're immortal! Shh! He took her hand to keep her close. She tensed but did not pull away. No. Well, sort of. It's a long story. Do you want to hear it? The little waiter picked this juncture to arrive with plates full of food that Theo could not even identify. Ethnic cooking gone mad and then confined in a lightless cave for centuries, and began setting them out, ignoring with professional skill the abrupt silence that had fallen over the table. Theo couldn't tell what was garnish and what was dinner, and could only identify which things were plates because they were on the bottom. It didn't matter, though. He was far too nervous to eat. When the waiter had slid off again, Theo told her everything, starting with a capsule summary of his life before crossing over to Fairy. It was tempting to glamorize things, but he didn't do it, giving her instead the exact and accurate picture. 30 years old, with a dead-end job, pretty fair musician, less than overwhelming people skills, especially when it came to relationships. He tried to gauge her mood, but what he thought of as the austere flower mask was still on her face. She sipped at her wine, picked at the food, and listened, but she kept her thoughts to herself. He told her of finding his great-uncle's book about the sudden entrance of the sprite, followed closely by the undead thing, about his startling arrival in a place he had never believed existed. By the time he got to the part about Applecore leading him to Daffodil House, the first wash of adrenaline was gone, and he was beginning to feel how hungry he was. He chose one of the least disturbing things in front of him, speared a piece on an odd, long-tined fork, and put it in his mouth. It wasn't too bad, although the combination of sweet and musky was a little hard to get used to at first, but the easing of terror made a very good sauce. As he told her the rest of what had happened to him, carefully avoiding any mention of Button or his plans and activities, he had no right to put the lives of the goblin and his comrades at risk, after all, no matter what he thought about the girl. He tried more and more of the kobold delicacies. The discovery of an arrangement of candied millipedes atop one of the dishes put him off for a moment, but he eventually made a mound of those things he liked best on his own plate. Eventually, almost every sentence of Theo history was punctuated by forkfuls of food. She was silent for a while after he finished. She drank off her wine, then picked up her purse and stood. "Are you leaving?" The fear suddenly clamped him again. He had let himself relax too much. Was she angry enough to sell him out? "No, I'm going to the toilet. Is that all right?" He nodded. He wanted her to assure him she wasn't going to call someone, that he wasn't going to be sitting here like an idiot when the special constables came crashing through the door, hornet guns blazing or buzzing or whatever they did, but he knew that if he was going to keep her on his side, he would have to trust her. People have died for worse principles, he thought, but I'd rather not die. It was perhaps the longest 10 minutes he'd spent since escaping from the burning wreck of Daffodil House. He sipped his water, pushed the remains of the kobold cuisine around on his plate, and did his best to appear to be someone not worth a second glance from any of the other diners. When he saw her coming back down the aisle, the mask of indifference still on her face, he had two simultaneous and completely different reactions. So, was I an idiot? Did she make a deal with her father? Her freedom for mine? She's really beautiful. Poppy settled in, not making eye contact. "I just want to know one thing," she said at last. I have to know. Did you come here because you wanted to use me to rescue your friend?" He suddenly wished he'd ordered a real drink, too. "Yes. That wasn't the only reason, but I hoped you could help me somehow. She's been more than a friend. I mean, she saved my life. More than once." Poppy nodded slowly. "But that wasn't the only reason, you said?" "I like you, Poppy. I always did. When I saw you at the camp, I realized that I'd missed seeing you." She squinted at him. "If you're trying to weave a glamour over me, Theo, whatever your name really is, you'd better remember that you're a beginner. If you're lying to me, I'll do worse to you than that lizard hellebore could ever dream of." Her gaze dropped back down to the table again. "I can't help you, Theo, even if I went back, and I'll never go back. They wouldn't let me onto the family floors at Hellebore House, not after the scene I made getting out of there. But I don't blame you for wanting to save your sprite friend, even if she is a snippy little bitch. So if you want to leave now, just tell me the truth and go. You don't have to worry about me. I won't betray you." But if you lie to me and pretend you care about me, thinking that you'll find a way to use me to help your friend after I've told you I can't, then I'll make you wish you had never met me. I truly will. Understood?" He was so relieved that he almost laughed. "Did anyone ever tell you that you're pretty scary for a 105-year-old? I'll bet that ogre kid still has nightmares." She looked blank. "Ogre? When you threw me out of the car, back when I first came to the city?" His smile began to feel uncomfortable. He still didn't feel very good about that day. "You'll be happy to know that Applecore told me I was a jerk about the way I treated you." Jerk? Sorry, a mortal expression that doesn't translate, I guess. "An idiot, an inconsiderate fool." Poppy nodded. "Then I hope you do save her. At least she's got some sense." What is it with women? You can hate each other's guts, but you all still band together to agree that men are pigs. Because men are pigs. A little bit of a smile had crept onto her face now, but as if she too felt she wasn't quite ready to deploy that particular bit of her arsenal, she grew serious again. "So, does this mean that you believe me when I say I can't help your friend?" "Yeah, I'm trying not to think about that too much. It makes me feel like the lowest scum in the world. Here I am, sitting in a nice restaurant, and she's in a bottle. But if they want you, they won't do anything to her. She's just a sprite. She doesn't matter." "Do you believe that?" "I used to, I suppose, but I meant she doesn't mean anything to them. Hellebore is cruel, but mostly he's about power. His son and that other creature, well, they might do anything, but he won't let them have her until he doesn't need her anymore, which means when he has you. As long as you're free, she's probably more or less all right." Theo sighed and sat back. "It all makes me feel sick. Let's talk about something else. What are you doing? Where are you staying? Are you going to go back to school?" "Do you really want to know?" Her neediness scared him a little, but he remembered that there was steel in her too, that he shouldn't underestimate her. That street punk ogre probably did still have nightmares. "Yes, really. And I think I'll have a glass of wine too." She was staying with a friend named Drusilla, it turned out, a girl she'd known from school who had dropped out to get married to a young fellow studying to be a chirurgeon. The two of them were living in a little house in the run-down forenoon suburbs at the city's extreme southern end, practically on the moon. "But it's a sweet house, and Drusilla and Donis are very happy," she explained. She didn't know what she was going to do about school. "It's my last year, and I hate the place. They don't want you to ask real questions. They just want you to learn enough to make polite conversation at dances with the boys from Dowsing Academy." She shook her head. "That's not for me, Theo. I've been trying to help out with some of the organizations like the Daughters of the Grove that are doing things for people who've been hurt by the fighting. It's the least I can do, considering my monster of a father started it all. But I don't think I could stick with that either. Most of these women are more worried about getting seen doing these good things than just getting them done. Yesterday, when you saw me, we were half an hour late starting because they wouldn't unload the truck until the scribes and the other mirror people were in place. It's like the young blossoms, except that everyone's surrounded by a cloud of youth charms so thick you could choke. I hate that." He had finished his wine, and despite feeling more relaxed than he had for days, he was beginning to worry about staying in one place too long. "Could we go for a walk? I'd like to get out of here." She gave him an appraising look. "A walk? Like on our legs?" "Sure." She paid the bill by, apparently, waving her fingers over it. He wondered how easy it would be for her father to track her down by her purchases. Rich girls, he suspected, didn't often think about things like that. He hadn't known many, but the few whose acquaintance he had made before Poppy hadn't led him to believe otherwise. There had been Sandra, for instance, a famous musician's daughter he had met at a club and briefly dated. She would simply walk out of restaurants and bars without paying, not intending to cheat anyone, but simply assuming, usually correctly, that everyone knew who she was and would bill her father, or bill her father's manager, to be more accurate, since the eminent bass player and sybarite who had sired her didn't take care of his own accounts any more than did the Queen of England. The chamber of congregation was less than a mile from the dockyards, and the smell of Ys was very distinct outside, much more like an ocean than it had seemed to him in the muddy flatlands next to the old Fayfort Bridge. She led him down some of the narrow lanes of Eastwater, where the leaning buildings and dark alleys felt like something out of the mortal world's early 1800s. New Orleans, perhaps, or the backwater districts of Naples. Strange music, as strange as that of the goblins, but undeniably different, drifted down from some of the upper stories. Kobolds? He asked, thinking of the restaurant. Poppy laughed. You really are the ultimate out-of-towner, aren't you? You couldn't get a kobold to live on an upper story if you gave them the flat for free. No, most of the people around here are regular working fairies, but that sounds like pixie music. There are more than a few of them out here, but most of them live right down in the dockyard area, or even on barges and houseboats. Theo liked the music, and he liked walking, feeling almost normal. He liked Poppy, too. He considered for a moment, then took her hand, knowing that he was crossing a sort of Rubicon, no matter how small the gesture might seem. They continued for a while in silence, the two of them for this moment moving effortlessly through the warm, damp night, like dolphins slipping side by side through tropical waves. She pulled him to a halt against a shadowy wall, just outside the will-o'-the-wisp gleam of a streetlight. For a moment he thought she had seen someone she knew in the crowd of young men laughing and talking loudly as they spilled out of a tavern across the street. But when they had vanished into the night, he realized that she had not stopped him out of fear at all. He put his arms around her, felt her fitting herself against him with the careful absorption of someone building something important. I'm glad you called me, she said. I thought about you a lot. He didn't want to say anything stupid. He didn't want to say anything at all. He had got himself into trouble in the past by struggling with the question of what to say in these situations, and he was even less certain now, but he hadn't told her a lie. Being with her was enough for now. So what else needed saying? She was a very good kisser. She went at it with fierce determination, not in a hurry, but not playing games either. There were only a few moments when he could concentrate enough to wonder why fairy kissing was so similar to human kissing, or to ask himself whether all fairy folk kissed each other like it was the most important thing to do in the entire universe. Or was it just Poppy Thornapple? The fact that she was technically a schoolgirl, which had worried him ever since she had first made her feelings clear, began to seem less important. However she might fit into her own society, by the chronology of his world, she had been living her life since somewhere before Teddy Roosevelt was in office. And that meant if anybody was jailbait around here, it was him. By fairy standards, Theo was probably in kindergarten or first grade. Her work in assembling their connection had not been in vain. She was molded against him so closely that it almost felt as though they were growing together, and every small movement she made seemed to touch him in several places at the same time. He was beginning to wonder if he might not just be blasted out of his mind on that single glass of fairy wine. His head felt quite floaty, and the rest of him warm and pleasurably itchy. Was it love? Now there was a staggering thought. There was certainly lust, but there seemed to be more. He pulled himself free, just a little, and laid his face against the side of her head. Her hair smelled like vanilla, like honeysuckle, like other things he couldn't even name, but which he wanted to keep smelling for the rest of his life. Half an hour ago he had been arguing with himself about whether he was leading this girl on, but now he was beginning to feel that He was the one in danger of falling, hopelessly and helplessly. Could she have used some charm on him? He didn't believe that. Maybe when she had first met him, but after she had screwed up her courage to give him that ultimatum, leave or stay, but be honest about it, God, I think it's real. I think it's real. Lost in the warm night, leaning against the wall and holding Poppy so close that he kept forgetting which way was up and other important things, it took him half a minute to notice the shape at the far end of the street. She was breathing in his ear and kissing and nibbling on it at the same time, and it was the most amazingly, distractingly nice thing that had happened to him in some while. But there was still something about the movement of the distant figure as it staggered from pool of light to shadow and then out into the light again that seized his attention. It lurched into another wash of light from a street lamp, perhaps 100 feet away from them, and he saw that it was wearing the armor of a police constable. His heart suddenly froze into a lump in his chest. He stepped away from the wall, almost knocking Poppy over, grabbed her arm and began to walk away so quickly that she stumbled. What is it? Behind us. That police, that constable. You can look, but for God's sake, keep walking. But we'll make him suspicious dashing away like this. Not unless it's a real constable. But I don't think it is. I told you about the thing that was after me. The last body it took was one of the constables at Daffodil House. Walk faster. When we get around the corner, we're going to run. I'm not going to run from some bugbear, Theo. I have a protection charm in my purse. You don't understand, Poppy. This thing is bad as it gets. Unless you have a charm that's the equivalent of a small-scale atomic bomb, we're better off just getting the hell out of here. Is it running? This time she sounded a bit more disturbed. It's walking fast. It moves really strangely. It probably has some pieces missing by now. How did you get here tonight? Please tell me you drove. I borrowed Drusilla's runabout. I hate trying to get a hired coach back from Eastwater at night. How far away is it? Never mind, we don't have any choice. I don't think even going into a place that's full of people is going to stop it. It just doesn't care. Here comes the corner. He squeezed her hand hard. You'll have to lead us. Wait until we're out of its sight. Now, run! They did, pelting up the street, heading back across Eastwater toward the restaurant. A few older fairies coming out of another building had to jump out of their way and shouted genteel imprecations after them, but Theo had no time to waste on someone's hurt feelings. Poppy had parked the small, sleek little car on a side street around the corner from the Chamber of Congregation. Theo could only bounce from foot to foot in nauseated panic as she fumbled through its unfamiliar door charm. On the third unsuccessful try, a bulky silhouette lurched around the corner and into the dark street, pausing for a moment to swing its helmeted head from side to side, more like a radar array than like a person actually looking for something. If Theo had retained any doubt about the identity of their pursuer, it was gone now. The thing did not move like any normal person, fairy or mortal. The arms hung slack at its sides, and the head swiveled like something mechanical. Got it, Poppy said as she yanked open the door. Theo ran around to the far side and climbed in, vaguely conscious that the seat seemed to wrap itself around him in a disturbingly lively way, but in too much of a panic to think about it. Just drive, he said. Distance. He turned to look. The thing was coming up fast now, stiff-legged but still horribly quick. He could see the face bouncing slackly under the helmet as it ran, its wearer uninterested in conveying mortal emotions, perhaps not even comprehending such things. Now! Hurry! The car hummed to life and almost jumped away from the curb. Theo had only a moment to pray that they were not parked in a dead-end street. They weren't. He looked back again to see the thing watching them go. There was nothing in its posture that spoke of defeat or frustration. It would simply start all over again, Already it was walking after them as it dwindled from view. Theo was suddenly extremely grateful that the thing hadn't captured any bodies that had wings. It didn't really seem to plan, so its horrible single-mindedness at least had one useful side effect. Still, given a choice, he would rather have not been chased by a relentless, deathless monstrosity, even if it did have a character flaw. But nobody was giving him a choice. Half an hour later, she pulled into the access road that led to the old Fayfort Bridge, parked and turned off the runabout's lights. He reached across and took her hand. Well, pretty interesting date, huh? He tried to laugh, but couldn't really manage. It was all a bit too awful for anything but the grimmest kind of humor. What are you going to do now? About Applecore or about you and me? She shrugged, smiled sadly. Both, I guess. It's not a very good time for us, is it? I don't know. I don't know much of anything, but I'm not going to just disappear or something if that's what you're worrying about. Well, I suppose I might, but it won't be by my choice. Don't say that, Theo. We'll think of something. I have friends. Some of them know important people. Yeah, but nobody, no matter how important they are, is going to make Hellebore stop what he's doing, and for some reason nobody can explain, I'm wrapped up in that. There were dozens of questions he should ask her, he realized. Things that the daughter of Hellebore's partner might know that others wouldn't. But it was too late, and he was too damn exhausted. Can I see you again? Of course. She took his hand, held it to her lips, then pressed it against her cheek. He stroked her black hair. Of course. I need to think. I need to ask questions. I know some people too, but... Oh, sorry. Of course. Of course. I need to think. I need to ask questions. I know some people too, but I'll call you soon. If I can figure out a way, I'll even do it myself this time. Their kiss again threatened to turn into something much more involved. It was extremely hard for his conscious mind to raise a quorum for letting go of her. His feet and legs wanted sleep after a day of walking and running, but the rest of his body thought the feet and legs were idiots, and the bits between his legs were on the verge of staging a full-scale mutiny. He pulled himself free while he still could, kissed her a few more times, then backed clumsily out of the small car. It wasn't that it was too early in their relationship. It was wartime, for God's sake. But more that he didn't have a place for her in his life yet, and feelings this surprisingly serious and strong would just blow him apart otherwise. Theo? She asked as he came back around to the driver's side window to kiss her goodbye again. Do you really share a tent with a goblin? And sing with them? Yeah, pretty much. He hesitated, worried that she would say some silly upper-class thing about them being dirty or criminal, and without meaning to make him feel wretched about liking her so much. That's so great! I always wanted to know a goblin. My father never let me go near any of them. He thought of Button's apparent plans for revolution. Everyone may get to know the goblins better one of these days. He kissed her. Good night, Poppy. Thanks for everything. I shouldn't say this, she told him, but I'll say it. You'd better call me. Theo waved as she made a laborious three-point turn and then headed back toward the city. He felt more like a teenager than he had in years. Yeah, been here before. I live in a world that makes no sense. The authority figures are all out to get me, and my glands have taken over. He walked back to the refugee camp, feeling a bit like he should sneak in quietly so he wouldn't wake his parents. And that's where we're going to stop. Just a few minutes past the hour, but since I spent a long time talking first, it seems only fair. Anyway, and that's the end of the chapter, so that's the place to stop anyway. So, with that, we will wrap it up. We will take down our tent. We will gather up our elephants and our zebras and our clowns and take this circus off somewhere else until circus season returns, 7 p.m. tonight. And with that, I thank you so much for joining me. And as I always want to say, please take good care of yourselves. You are very important to me. Take good care of your loved ones, your friends and family, and keep an eye out for your neighbors who, during this time of pandemic and economic suffering and many other kinds of worry and concern, there are probably people all around you that could use a little helping hand here or there, or just a friendly voice. And I, to the extent that I am a friendly voice, which I try to be, but I will be back at 7 p.m. Later today or tomorrow, depending on if you're like me and still think it's Saturday or not. And again, I want to thank everybody for who offered us support and kind words over losing our beloved friend Frankie, which has been very tough. But as I said before, life goes on, and I wish you all the best and lots of love from the Beal Williams Honor Rancho, and I'll see you very soon. Thanks. Good night.